Assalamu alaikum, can you hear me? Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. I only learned tonight that, I'm sorry, what was your name? Taha. That Taha was actually a student at the University of Toronto, but he never took a class with me, so you can see, how distinguished I really am. Anyway, Assalamu alaikum. It's my great pleasure to be here. This is the second time I've had the opportunity to be here. It's always nice to see friends. When Hassan asked me to come and speak, I was, of course, delighted to. And then when he told me the topic, I said, wow, this will be a really short talk. Absolutely glad to talk about it. So the prospects or the future of democracy in the Muslim world, I could just say bleak. I could be done with it, sadly. And I doubt that there's long need for me to go into all the details about the terrible tragedies that we are living through right now, particularly in the Arab region. But sadly, given the role and the status of the Arab world, it obviously has an influence on the rest of the Muslim world. In these circumstances, unfortunately, it's a very negative influence because of the fact that now we have the leading Arab states waging war against their own people who seek to have just a minimum voice in governing their own affairs. And they are destroying their own societies quite literally in order to prevent their own people from having any voice in their own future. And to make things worse, they are enrolling some of the ulama to try to convince the people that to be a true Muslim is to obey your ruler sort of without question. And that to attempt to hold the ruler accountable is a form of masiyah, deserving even capital punishment. Accusations of terrorism, etc., etc. We're familiar with all of that. And so I don't want to go into all the details about that. And then we also see the tragic situation of our brother Uyghurs in China. They're literally in concentration camps. The Chinese government is trying to wipe out every trace of their Islamic identity. I don't know. I assume that most of us are aware in general of the situation of the Uyghurs, but you might not be aware of the details of their persecution. The Chinese government has set up a 24/7 system of monitoring every action that these people do. They literally cannot move anywhere without being monitored by the highest tech surveillance technology known to mankind. And I assure you that this will not stop in China, but that Muslim governments all over the world will be begging the Chinese to give this technology to them. So that when you go to any Muslim country, you will be subject to the same kind of treatment that the Uyghurs are today. Right? And so we find ourselves in this terrible situation where Muslim majority countries, the people are being stripped of any ability to speak out for themselves without risking literally death or even worse, right? And then we see a refusal by Muslim countries who, on the relative scale of things, treat their people better, right? But are too cowardly to say anything. So we see, for example, a country like Pakistan turning a blind eye to what the Chinese are doing because they are in such desperate need of financial support from China. They're in such desperate need of financial support, they invite the Crown Prince, the so-called Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, to Pakistan and give him their highest civilian medal honor. The Medal of Honor, I'm not exactly sure for what. We all know the crimes that he has committed, and that the proper place for a person like that is jail, not getting honored by any kind of civilized government. But there we have it. So that's the kind of the situation that we face. Now, not all, I think, is terribly as bleak as these situations, as these examples might suggest. Perhaps in countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, we might see there might be some chances for some sort of progress insofar as they are fortunately far enough away from the rot of the Arab world that they can develop along some sort of line that is reasonably independent and reasonably free. So, what do I want to talk about, since Hassan told me I can't just make it a short talk? Should we care? Why should we Muslims care about democracy? Isn't democracy a Western idea anyway? We shouldn't care about it. We should just be happy with what we have. The Prophet ﷺ said you should be content with your ruler even if he's giving you lash on your back, and you should just endure it. Right? This is what these religious scholars, some of them, are teaching us anyway. So who was Mohammad Fadel to stand in front of you and say, no, you deserve better in life than having Mohammed bin Salman and Bashar al-Assad and Abdel Fattah al-Sisi ila akhirihi, right? Who am I to say you deserve better than that? Well, I think, right, it's not Muhammad Fadel saying this, it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying this, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us with the purpose of the Khilafah, right, which is a dignified office which He gave to all human beings, right? And the least that means is that we don't serve each other, we only serve God, and that it is sinful for one human being to take another to be his slave and his tool, and not allow him or her to live the life that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants that person to live. So to acquiesce to this kind of despotism, in my opinion, is a grave, grave act of blasphemy against God. Now, that doesn't mean that you have a duty to rise up and go to war and kill yourself. But at the minimum, we have to have in our hearts a belief that we despise this oppression, and we ask God to relieve us of this burden of oppression and give us something better. We have to believe this in the depth of our heart, that this is wickedness that Islam does not accept, and that we hope for the day when it goes away. So about a century ago, there was a Syrian sheikh named Rashid Rida who wrote a book after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I, and when the Turkish Republic abolished the caliphate. It only existed in name at that point anyway. And he called it Al-Khilafa or Al-Imam Al-Uzma. And what he was trying to do was try to think about a way to constitute a modern system for the Khilafah that would serve the needs of the Muslim community and not serve the ends of despots and tyrants. And one of the things he said there was that the constitution of Islam is a kind of republic. He called it Darbun min al-Jumhuriyya, right? That the government that Islam demands is a kind of republican government, not capital R for the party in the United States where I'm from, but republican with a small r, meaning a government that's rooted in the consent of the people, that depends on the people's participation, i.e. a type of self-government under law, right? And so he said that all laws in the Islamic order are either an express command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or ra'yul ummah, right? And particularly when the ummah has a consensus on something, then it's inconceivable that its rulers can go against it. Now, this is an idea that's very deeply rooted in the Sunni tradition, and I talked about this, I think, the first time I was here, the idea of the ruler or public officials generally being agents of the community, acting pursuant to power that the community delegates to them, meaning that they have no personal power. Right? And this is a very important idea in republicanism as a political idea outside of Islam. Right? There's an idea in political theory known as republicanism. And the idea, the fundamental principle of republicanism is something known as non-domination. That it is against the dignity of human beings for one human being to dominate another human being. And the purpose of politics is to establish a political order that minimizes the risk of arbitrary domination. Okay? And so law is a fundamental tool in achieving this end of non-domination. Because when we live under law, we know in advance what we can do and what we cannot do, and therefore avoid the risk of somebody acting out of his or her own whim in a way to restrict our freedom and our ability to live. Okay? And so this idea is very deeply rooted in Islamic political thinking. So there's a very famous sheikh from the late Ayyubid period named Al-Izz ibn Abd salam. He was Syrian, he lived in Egypt as well. And he said that in principle, al-asli, in principle, no human being awla bi-ta'a min ghayrihi. No human being has a superior claim to be obeyed than anybody else, right? The only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has an inherent right of obedience, right? As for us, we are all equal. No one of us has any superior right to demand the obedience of another than any other human being. So he recognizes that the central problem of politics is to explain in what circumstances obedience is just. And what I'm saying is that the whole line of Islamic political thinking is that obedience is just when it does not entail domination. Okay? And a command, obeying a command does not entail domination when it is a just command. It's a just command, for example, if it's consistent with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to do. That's our belief as Muslims, of course. It's also a just command if it's the command that we give to ourselves. So I mentioned, again, last time when I was here, and maybe I will refresh your recollections, you might not have all been here, but the great Hanafi jurist, Al-Kasani, wrote about the Khalifa. He said the Khalifa has the power to appoint judges and to dismiss judges. But in reality, the Khalifa never appoints judges or dismisses judges. In all cases, it's the Muslim community that's appointing judges and dismissing judges. Because the wilaya, the jurisdiction of the Khalifa, is wilayat al-Muslimin. The Khalifa has no personal interest in the judge, right? He's appointing judges solely for the good of the Muslim community, maslahat al-Muslimin. So in that respect, Kasani calls him a Rasul. Now, if anybody here has a background in Hanafi fiqh, Rasul is a technical term. So there are all kinds of different agents that one might have. Rasul is the lowest kind of agent that you have. It's the one who does the most ministerial tasks. You send your servant to go to the market and buy you some bread. He's your Rasul. Okay? So for Kasani, that's what the caliph is, because the caliph has no independent interest in any of the things that he's doing. Everything that the caliph does is on behalf of the Muslim community. So the caliph has the right to appoint judges and dismiss judges, and the right to do this and that, but only because everything he's doing is doing for us. Right? He is our ministerial agent, and by implication, we can hold him accountable, and all public officials follow that kind of analogy. Okay? And so clearly, so then Kasani goes on to say, so when the caliph appoints a judge or dismisses a judge, it's the fi'al, it's the action of ammat al-Muslimin. Right? It's not the caliph that's appointing, it's the Muslim community that's appointing. And it's the Muslim community that's dismissing. So here you have an example of what I'm trying to say, is that in Sunni political thought, when the judge orders you to appear before him, that's not an arbitrary command that represents an act of domination, because at least in ideal Sunni theory, you have consented to appointing the caliph, who is then done ijtihad to appoint the judge, who's qualified, etc., etc. So you have meaningfully consented to all of these things. So you are obeying yourself, right? You're not obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but you are obeying yourself, right? Through a moral exercise of your independent judgment. Okay. So this idea of non-domination, I think, is crucial to our self-conception of as being Muslims. Again, I'm going to, even though I don't study Hanafi fiqh nearly with the same depth that I do in Maliki fiqh, but Hanafis have this very, very valuable qaida, right? So al-mu'min la yudhillu nafsahu. Al-mu'min la yudhillu nafsahu. A believer does not degrade himself. This qaida is cited by Hanafi jurists in numerous abwab, in numerous different topics of fiqh. It's not just one here, one there. It shows up in several places. The great Damascene Hanafi, sometimes they call him Khatam al-Muhaqqiqeen, Ibn Abidin, right, uses it to talk about the employment relationship. And he says there's no dhul, there's no abasement greater than when a human being runs after, degrades himself in order to obtain money. This is what I want to talk about in greater depth, because if you think carefully about the situation where you're in today, it's because of our failure to adhere to this principle. So I'm going to go back now to Imam Malik in the Muwatta and talk about the condition of a slave. Okay? So in the Muwatta, first of all, the Muwatta, for most people today, they think of it as a book of hadith, because most people only are interested in the hadiths that are in it. The hadiths that are in it aren't close to being a majority of the book. Much of the book is Malik's own ijtihad. And so when he talks about slavery and the manumission of slaves, he's engaged in his own fiqh ijtihad, but it's very, very revealing and very interesting, because it shows us the value that Malik radiallahu anhu placed on human freedom and human dignity. Okay? So there's a contract, we might be familiar with this, that there was something called kitaba or mukataba, where a slave, the master of a slave, could tell his slave, if you give me 1,000 dinars or 1,000 dirhams or whatever, you'll be free. Okay? So the custom in those contracts was that often the master would say, okay, I need you to bring me, let's say, 5,000 dirhams, and I want you to pay me 1,000 every year, 5 years. Okay, so you could think of it as an installment sales contract. Okay? Now, technically, this is a sort of a technical point of fiqh, but you need to understand it to understand the issue here. In normal debt contracts in Islamic law, the fuqaha tell us that if I, as a debtor, agree to prepay my debt to the creditor for a discount, that's riba, and it's not permitted. So, for example, if I owe Sheikh Zahid, Muhammad Zahid here $5,000, and I'm supposed to pay him $1,000 every year, and after year one I tell him, yeah, Sheikh, I'll pay you $3,000 right now, just forgive the other two, they would say, that's haram. Okay? Just accept that. So the issue that Malik was asked about was, well, what happens when you have a mukataba, a kitaba contract with your slave? Can the master agree to accept a lesser payment than was originally stated in exchange for immediate prompt payment. So in the initial example I gave, the master told the slave, you can have your freedom if you pay me 5,000 dirhams, 1,000 for the next 5 years. Okay, so then after year 1, the master goes to the slave, you know what, I'll free you now if you give me 3,000 today. Is that okay? Okay? So Malik said, yes, that's okay. That's okay. Because this is not like the contract that I proposed between myself and Sheikh Mohammad Zahid here. Why not? Because he said a contract for manumission is not about dirhams and dinars. It's not about profit. It's about hurriya. It's about freedom. And it's about isma. And it's about hurma. That the maqsood, the purpose of it, is for the slave to become a free person and to enjoy the status of a free person. Now it's interesting what Malik understands to be the privileges of being a free person. It's not to amass property, because according to Malik, a slave could own property. A slave could amass property. A slave, in fact, could have his own slaves. So Malik speaks about, what happens when a slave has his own slave and all these other rules, etc. So a slave could have property. A slave could enjoy wealth up to a certain point. Well, there's no level as to how much wealth he could accumulate, but this was the thing. Everything that the slave amassed, at any moment, what could happen? The master could take it away. Called the i'tisar. The master could take whatever the slave obtained because the master owns the slave. It doesn't mean that the master would do that. In fact, it's very likely that lots of masters didn't care. But the point is that for Malik, freedom was not about the opportunity to go into the market and make a lot of money, because slaves could already do that. Slaves could do that. But what slaves couldn't do, they couldn't be a witness in front of a judge. They could be slandered. They weren't protected by the rules of slander. If they committed adultery, they got the punishment, they got a much lesser punishment. Right? In other words, they had a lesser status in the eyes of the law than a free person. And so for Malik, what the slave desired was to be recognized as a person fully capable of exercising all the rights of a free person and ability to live up to all the obligations of a free person. Very important. Not just rights, but also obligations. And so freedom for Malik was about the eagerness of the slave to demonstrate his capacity to live a responsible life, fully responsible under the law, just like anybody else. Not about getting money. Okay? Now, what has happened to us, right? In a word, in my opinion, right? Particularly in the Arab world, the situation is the reverse. Why does Jared Kushner think that it's okay or plausible or believable that Palestinians would give up every right they have for money? Well, he might think, but isn't that what all the Arabs have done themselves? I'm Egyptian, but I've been in the United States and Canada since 1970. But today, the greatest ambition of Egyptians is to go work in the Gulf and make some money, come home, buy an apartment, get married, etc. Repeat. Have children, send them to private school, and then send them back to the Gulf to make money and come back again. Where is their appreciation for having rights and standing for themselves with dignity, right? It's very, very low on the totem pole. And we all know, because many of us have experience in the Gulf, that there's a very clear bargain that you enter into when you go to the Gulf. We'll give you money, you shut up. Right? That's the bargain that's on the table. And the reality is, the sad reality is, millions of Muslims have accepted that bargain and have shown that they value money more than their rights. So why shouldn't Kushner and Trump think that they can do that to the Palestinians? Say, well, look, all of your brethren have the same deal. None of them care about self-government. What's all this nonsense about freedom and self-government and self-determination? Look at the Arab world. None of you have citizens, true citizens. All of you are willing to give up rights for money. So I'm giving you the same thing. Okay? And if you think carefully about this, this is the reality. This has spread, right, from the Gulf to the rest of the Muslim world. Every Muslim country that has a strong connection, economically speaking, to the Gulf suffers from this, where huge numbers of their populations willingly trade their rights in order to get some money. Once we do that, of course, we are degrading ourselves, because we know when we go there that anything can happen to us. We all hear stories all the time of horrific mistreatment that has happened to people, right? Well, why do we go? Well, we're kind of gambling because we're hoping it's not going to happen to us. Right? This is precisely what Ibn Abidin was talking about when he said, "La yudhillu al-mu'min nafsahu," that there's no dhul, there's no kind of abasement worse than when the person allows himself to be used by others simply for the sake of money without regard for his own standing as a person, as a Muslim, as somebody who is a Khalifa that Allah created for certain reasons. Right? And so what we really need to talk about is why dignity is important to us. Why is it important to us? Why is it worth dying for? We have thousands and thousands and thousands of people in Syria, Allah yarhamhum, dying for dignity. Can we even understand what that means? If we can't understand that, then we don't understand why democracy is valuable, because we don't think our lives are valuable. If we think that we can trade our lives for a certain sum of money, then, right, we've said that our lives are not precious. They're not priceless, right? And this is where dhul, abasement, enters into our existence. Now, I don't know what kind of answers are there for us, but we have to begin by recognizing that not everything is subject to sale. That if we are going to live lives as dignified, free human beings, free Muslims, well, there's a price that we have to pay for that. Alhamdulillah, we are here in this great country where laws protect us. So you shouldn't be afraid to exercise your rights. Don't live your life in fear. Right? Try to overcome that. If we want to have democracy in the Muslim world, right, we have to want it for the right reasons, namely, which is for our dignity as human beings and our dignity as Muslims that God demands of us. Right? And so dignity is something that is not given to you. It's something that you have to earn by showing a willingness to sacrifice. And you know, I study Islamic legal history, and so you know, I read lots of texts. And there are things that you come across and you find, my gosh, it's hard to believe that people thought this way because it's so far from our experience. But a year and a half ago, I was reading with my students the chapter on coercion in Kitab al-Asl of Mohammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani. So Kitab al-Ikrah, a big chapter in his book about coercion. And the idea is, when is somebody's action so unfree that it excuses him from legal liability? Okay? Now, we live in a world in which we are willing to excuse everybody on the slightest grounds. You know, my alarm clock went off. I hit the snooze button too many times. Sorry, I was late. Right? I mean, so we accept excuses like, you know, like it's raining. No problem. Right? For the Muslims of Shaybani's generation, they were very demanding people. So, as a general rule, for example, there was no excuse for killing another person. Ikrah is not an excuse for killing an innocent person. Even if you know that you will be killed if you refuse the command of the tyrant, that doesn't give you an excuse to kill an innocent person. Now, imagine what our societies would be like if we believed that. If we accepted this idea that coercion does not excuse the sin of murder, could a tyrant like Bashar al-Assad be in power today? Could Saddam Hussein have been in power today? Could Sisi be in power today? Could Mohammed bin Salman be in power today? No. Because we are their enablers. This is the truth. We enable them because we don't have the courage, the moral courage to resist them. And we convince ourselves that God will forgive us because we are, what can we do? Ana ghalban. You know? But even outside of the spectacular issue of murder and rape, which sadly in our part of the world is not all too exceptional, even in the context of property, right? Shaybani seems to think that everybody should be able to display a certain amount of courage. So he says, you know, that if you're lashed 10 times, that's not enough to justify giving your property to a zalim. Right? That's, you know, you should be able to resist that. Now, I think one of the big problems that we have is that we have some people who get very, very full of zeal, right? And they want to do right. And so then they get these books and they start reading them and they start applying them as though we're living in the 2nd century of the Hijrah. We know that type. I'm not saying anything like that at all. What I'm trying to say is that we need to take inspiration from these kinds of figures. These figures who understood the importance of courage, who understood the virtue of dignity, who understood that virtue is more important than money, right? And we have to internalize those values in a way that's appropriate for our age, right? We're not going to be the Sahaba. We're not going to be, you know, people in the Umayyad time or Abbasid time. You know, tilka ummatun qad madat, right? We are who we are, but we have to still manifest these kinds of virtues if we want to have self-respect. And if we don't respect ourselves, nobody else will respect us. This is something that we really must understand, right? Nobody will take you. I mean, as an Egyptian, right? It's painful what happened in Egypt because nobody takes Egypt seriously. Like 2 weeks ago, no, I guess President Morsi died in the courtroom, Allah yarhamu. And so this columnist in Foreign Policy wrote, Morsi's death highlights Egypt's irrelevance. Okay? And it's sad, but it's true. How can a country of 100 million people be irrelevant? Because they've chosen to make themselves irrelevant. They've chosen to make themselves irrelevant because they don't respect themselves. And you see how they don't respect themselves in numerous ways. Sometimes in the way they treat an ex-president in court, really disgusting, right? Regardless of your view, how can you allow an ex-president to be treated that way, to have a heart attack in court and not even try to treat him? Embarrassing by any stretch of the imagination, right? To things like, how do you spend your public resources? So Egypt is a poor country. You should think that a poor country would want to spend money to improve the lives of its people, to give them schools, to give them hospitals, etc. But ever since 2013, every year, the spending on education and health has gone down, and now it's about 50% of what it was in 2013. So a country like this shows no respect for itself because it doesn't respect its own people. So if it doesn't respect its own people, how can it earn respect in the world, right? You're asking the impossible. So I just want to sort of conclude here by reminding you and reminding me that anti-domination, anti-subordination is a core moral value of Islam. Muslims, right, are not supposed to do sajda for anyone except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? But that also means that we shouldn't humiliate ourselves in other ways. That we have to value our rights and our dignity above everything else. Don't put yourself in a situation where you are sacrificing your rights for a trivial gain. Right? Exercise your rights. If you don't exercise your rights, you're going to lose them because nobody will take you seriously. Right? And so if we learn that, if we get that habit, right? If we say, you know, I don't care that my country is poor, but I am not going to abase myself before somebody who kills his own citizens and dismembers them in the national embassy, right? I am not going to degrade myself by honoring a criminal like that. Instead of thinking this as a dollar-cents calculation, think of what this says about your honor as a human being before God and the kind of hypocrisy that's required to engage in this kind of praise. And so this is the kind of moral awareness that we need to be engaged in. Right? This is the kind of message that we need to be giving the Muslim community, not only just in Canada, but also to our friends and brothers and sisters everywhere, right? That don't give in to those who want to tell you you are not worthy of dignity. No, we are all worthy of dignity. Especially we as Muslims, we know this. We know this more than anyone else. And so it's tragic to see Muslims to be the first people willing to barter their dignity. Right? It's a losing battle. It's a losing deal. You will lose. Whenever you sell your dignity for money, you will end up without dignity and you will end up bankrupt. So I will stop here, inshallah, and I guess we can have a discussion if you guys like. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Hassan, do you want me to answer or? Right. Yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mohammed. I have two questions that I was thinking about many times. The first is that you mentioned that there is a problem within the Muslim community, a fear and abasement for wealth, and that's in the Muslim majority countries at the moment. But wouldn't you agree that that is the same abasement of wealth that brought a lot of us desire to prosper economically, for our children to be educated well. That is what brought us here. So does that make us or our values more superior or in a better place than the Muslims in the Muslim majority countries? That's the first question. The second question, which I have and I felt that you did not address, was the foreign influence when it comes to promoting the so-called democracy. And you mentioned briefly about Mohammad H, the democratically elected president, that was not only deposed, but also has been continuously ignored by Western democracy. And, you know, forgetting about the Gulf countries, you know what to expect from them. They don't want democracy. That is against their interests. But we see Western nations that promote democracy wherever they go, and now they can watch a democratically elected president die in court and not say anything about it. What does that say about democracy as a word and as a value that Muslims should follow or use even that term?
Okay. First question, right? What does that say about our motives here, right? I'm not trying to say that anyone is better than anybody else, but everyone needs to check his niyyah, right? What I'm saying in general, the advantage, the ni'mah that we have here is that we can come here and we can pursue our economic well-being without trading our dignity, in the sense that we are not making ourselves subservient to the arbitrary will of a single person. Okay? So this is a ni'mah, this is a great ni'mah. Lots of us don't recognize this as a ni'mah. They think of the ni'mah as, oh, I've got a house, I have 2 cars, I've got a lot of money. No, the ni'mah is that you can pursue your well-being in a way that protects you from domination by others, right? And let me say, one reason, I don't want to be too hard on the Muslim world. كَادَ الْفَقْرُ يَكُونُ كُفْرًا, right? Poverty is almost kufr. Why? Because we are bodies. God created us, yes, with a soul, and yes, with reason, but also a body. And the body has shahwa. One of the shahwas is accumulation of things. One of the shahwas is to be recognized as having standing in front of others. And one of our appetites is, having visible signs of success, right? Right? So this is part of the same human nature that God created in us, right? The problem is how to pursue those things in a way that does not degrade you, right? And part of the reason why I consider democracy valuable is that it allows us to pursue these things without making us subject to the arbitrary will of somebody else. Because when you're subject to the arbitrary will of somebody else, what do? You learn all sorts of vicious habits. You learn hypocrisy. You learn to be obsequious. You lie. You flatter. We all know this, right? We all know, right? In Egypt, ya bey, ya sahab al-ma'ali, ma'rafsh eh, right, etc., etc. All these words that are meaningless just because this person has power over you and you're trying to seek a favor from him. All of this is against the adab of Islam. So again, Al-Izz ibn Abd salam says the reason why to obey somebody else in some respects is contrary to Aqidah. Because he says that it is our belief that only God is the author of blessing and deprivation. So when you approach another person thinking that person is the key to your success, you're misunderstanding your belief as a Muslim. But whenever you do that, you're degrading yourself, right? So what we want is to be able to live in a social world where we can pursue our natural ends that God has created in us, right, in a way that doesn't degrade us, right? And in my opinion, that's most effectively achieved within the context of a democracy, because within a democracy, nobody has arbitrary power over another. Right? Okay, so, but of course, you're right. Many people come here, all they want is money. That's bad. That's bad. They are selling themselves short. Right? They are degrading themselves. And so we ask Allah to protect us from that. Okay? Now, the second question you had was about Western hypocrisy. Okay, the West is hypocritical. So what? If somebody treats me badly, is that an excuse for me to treat myself poorly? I mean, we want this for ourselves, not because America is going to pat us on the back, or Canada is going to pat us on the back, or I don't know who else is going to pat us on the back. Right? You want to succeed in school because that's good for you. Even if you're performing excellently in school and the school is biased against you and will not give you the accolades you deserve, does that mean you stop studying and you stop being excellent? Of course not. Right? So we want this for ourselves, not because other people will, let us into some sort of club. Right? So, okay, let's grant that the West is hypocritical. So what? Right? We let them be hypocritical. Is my first response. Right? Anyway, yes.
So, when you mentioned regarding the dignity of the self-made work, you touched mostly the idea you bring in here today is circling around the Arab democracy or the democracy in the Arab world. But you didn't touch where we have a successful model at the moment, and I can say in Turkey, you can say that last 15 years, the democracy is very, not only financially, but socially also, that nation is going up. That's one. And the other country is where I from, Pakistan. You can say that sometimes the democracy is struggling, but you will see that the people will challenge the ruler, they change the ruler, they sacrifice their life for that as well. So we see that the democracy is bringing some dignity and some sort of justice in the society as well. So that's and my question is that why Arab world is not accepting democracy to get the dignity in their place?
Okay, well, I think the biggest reason why it's very difficult for democracy to establish itself in the Arab world is because of the effects of oil and the fact that vast amounts of wealth are in the hands of a very small number of people. And in any kind of democratic regime, that would change, quite simply, right? And so they have a vast amount of money to spend fighting political change. Again, no matter how moderate, right? What happened in Egypt, for example, was hardly threatening to anybody. It wasn't like the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 in Russia, where they were rounding up people and killing them and taking over their factories or anything like that. Or in Iran in 1977. Right? But despite that, they felt that any kind of even gesture toward genuine popular rule threatened them. Right? And again, I think it's just a matter of money, that the rulers are just unwilling to give up any of their privileges. And so this is the general problem that you have in the Arab world, that the rulers have access to resources that allow them to dominate their people, right? And they don't want to give that up. Okay, so you mentioned Turkey and Pakistan. Well, compared to the Arab world, it's hard to look bad. That's kind of my answer, right? And I know lots of people have great sentiments for Erdogan, and there's lots of things that I like about him, principally that he's been good to the Syrians, okay? But there's a lot of negatives on his slate. Erdogan, in many ways, represents what Rida was very worried about. Rida talked about something, he said, شعوبية إسلامية, Islamic populism, instead of a law-based constitutional regime that was based on genuine ijtihad, genuine reason, and learning. So he was critical of Ataturk, not because of his heresies or whatever, but he said Ataturk is depending on his popularity as a military commander. And so his legitimacy does not derive from a commitment to scientific thought and a constitutional order, et cetera, but it's on his personal charisma. And one day he's going to die. And what's going to happen? Same thing right now I am afraid of in Turkey. If you look at the AKP, it's been destroyed. It's now a personality cult. So many of the people who were leaders in the AKP have been kicked out of the party. So it's very worrisome. Again, Pakistan, again, as I said, if you're comparing it to the Arab world, it's going to look good, right? But you know, they hosted both Mohammed bin Salman and gave him all these honors, and they say they know nothing about what's going on in China. So, still far from where we want to be. Malaysia and Indonesia, I think, are much better, much further down the road in terms of having national self-respect to build something hopeful, right? So the Malaysians, they ousted their prime minister who was involved in a huge amount of corruption, again with the assistance of Saudi Arabia, unfortunately, right? It's very sad to say that whenever you find corruption, expect Saudi Arabia to be close by, right? Sadly, that's the unfortunate reality, right? So, you know, again, I can't make any sort of long-term predictions, but I think Southeast Asia is much more hopeful than the Middle East. And you know, that's not bad. Indonesia is the biggest Muslim country in the world. Why shouldn't we think of Indonesia maybe as the center of Islam, right? Okay, right? I mean, you know, right now, the leading Arab countries are, I don't want to say fighting Islam, because they're fighting everything, right? I mean, they are just, you know, at least people like Abdel Nasser and Bourguiba and Ataturk, they wanted their societies to progress. These people are simple thieves, right? That's all they are. They're thieves. Not more, not less, right? And so they're the lowest of the low, in my opinion. Right? Unfortunately, they have lots of money, and our people can be easily bought. This Haftar fellow in Libya, where he's got an army of mercenaries. Where's the money coming from? The UAE, right? So. Marxist? Okay.
If you look at it in that sense, it will always have a significant influence. On one hand, there is the idea of democracy where we conceptualize equal rights for everyone, but in reality, in all democracies, you see that south of the border, the one who has more money has more influence. You talked about hypocrisy, lying, and deceit as something that plagues Muslim world and is almost an antithesis to democracy. But if you look at the election of Trump or his campaign money that he's just basically breaking records for the 2020 campaign, his whole persona, like Erdogan, like MBS, it's all about publicity and perception, regardless of what the truth is. So how do we understand, or how do we place these ideas of equality of humans and dignity of the soul
Well, we have a great advantage. We have a great advantage. Right? We have a great advantage. And that's that we know that when we die, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will judge us. And all of that will be meaningless. Right? And so you have to have hope. Right? And this is sort of my point, maybe a good point to remind us on, that why do we have an aqidah? Why do we have religion? Because it gives us hope to actually deserve the dignity that God says we have. But as I said, we have to earn it, right? And so if you believe that none of this ultimately, or none of what happens here is the end of things, right? That true justice will be served after we die, then that gives you an immense amount of strength, right? That gives you an immense amount of strength. And as I said, tyrants cannot exercise their tyranny without passive assistance. So there's a very famous German political philosopher of Jewish origin named Hannah Arendt, who became very famous for the phrase, the banality of evil. So there was this Nazi apparatchik named Adolf Eichmann, who the Israelis kidnapped after World War II and eventually put him to death for his participation in the Holocaust. And she attended the trial. And what she said was very interesting, was like, you might have thought that Adolf Eichmann was a monster. But no, he was just a normal man who would go to work, oversee the process of killing people at an industrial scale, and then go home to his wife, have dinner, play with his kids, kiss them, put them to bed, and then go home and go to work and do the same thing, right? So the reality is that this mass killing, these mass atrocities, these mass crimes can only take place because average people like you and me participate in them passively and say, no, I don't want to do it. And this is why this idea, لا طاعة لمخلوق في معصية الخالق, is so crucial to our understanding of politics in Islam. No obedience to a creature and disobedience to God. As I said, it's not an excuse in Islamic law to say, my boss told me to kill him. That's not an excuse. There's qisas for that. Yes, there is. Right? So you don't need Nuremberg to tell you that obeying orders is not a defense to a criminal order. Right? The Muslims said this 1,000 years ago. Right? And so the only question is, do we want to live up to our own ideals? These are the ideals that we need to live up to. Right? You know, in that case, I have no problem obeying the imam. Right? Because I obey the imam only if his commands are just. But when he commands me to commit a sin, I say, no, sorry. You're on your own, buddy. Right? And if everybody had that attitude, we wouldn't see what we're having now. Right? And money wouldn't affect me, etc. Now again, you might say that's utopian. But you know, every day look around you, you see people who take stands. The question is, why don't more of us do? And one of the reasons, if you study political theory, human beings, in many ways, are happy with despots. Right? So the Quran condemns the Egyptians for following Pharaoh. It doesn't excuse them. It condemns them. It says كَانُوا قَوْمًا فَاسِقِينَ, because they followed him. Right? And so we have to take responsibility for ourselves. We can't just keep making excuses.